In experiencing life, we will experience sometimes misfortune, distress, suffering, and misery. How do we react in life to those things? Those things will come crashing down upon us whether we believe in God or not. They're there, they're reality. What should we think about them? How should we react toward them? What we see in God's Word is that if we don't believe in God or not, if we're looking at life just under the sun, we'll see, as the Ecclesiastes writer tells us, in Ecclesiastes, the 9th chapter, that we will experience life, and sometimes it will be viewed as time and chance happeneth to them all. The race does not belong to the one that is swift. Sometimes calamity happens that changes that. Favor doesn't always come to those who have knowledge. But as a bird is snared very quickly, so the children of men are snared, and it suddenly comes upon them. That happens. That's a reality. How should we react to that? For those of us who believe in God, how does He come into play? Where is God in my calamity? We first of all need to understand that God is there knowing that we have this calamity. In Matthew 10 and verse 29, 2 sparrows are sold for a penny, Jesus says, but not one of them fall to the ground without the Father. If the Father knows when the sparrow falls, He knows when you are going through your darkness of calamity. He not only knows that, but He's there with us as He's viewing that. Psalm 139 is a great psalm teaching us that God has searched out our paths and He knows our lying down. Psalm 139 and verse 3. There's not a place that we can go that escapes the presence of the knowledge of God. We cannot flee from His presence. He's always there. In the times when we think we have no God around us, He's right there, holding us up in His right hand and leading us through the calamity. The moment we think that darkness overwhelms us, we need to understand in verse 12 that it's just like light to Him. He seeth in the darkness. Nothing is hidden from Him with whom we have to do. So we begin to see that in this psalm, and also in Matthew 10 and verse 29, that God knows when we're going through these times of misfortune and calamity. The second question is, if He knows about it, why doesn't He do something about it? And the point is that He does. First of all, He allows sin to take place upon this earth. He allows people to do bad things to other people. He is aware of this, but what He's doing, it's not escaping His view. He's bringing judgment upon it. He sees the ungodliness done, He condemns it. And we know that in His time, He will bring all of these works of evil to judgment. Ecclesiastes, the 3rd chapter, in verse 16 and 17, we're observing when we're looking for righteousness, that unrighteousness is there, injustice is there, when we ought to have justice. But there's a time for every purpose, for every work under heaven. God will bring every secret of man to judgment, Romans 2 in verse 16. So nothing gets past God. God is there, even in times of sin. It's not His will that people sin, but from His eternal perspective, He will exercise His sovereignty over man in the judgment, when His wrath is turned into the experience of hell for the people who have not repented of the evil that they have done. And I think these terms, these words of God, they should help us in times of our calamity. Let me give you an example of something that's very troubling and people don't want to think much about it. But what happens when a child is sexually abused? What happens when an adult is sexually abused? Look at these passages. Does God know that's happening in that dark room, in that secluded place? Yes, He knows. What is He doing about it? He's allowed it to happen because it's happened. But what He's doing is that he's there condemning it. He's there in his wrath with his judgment. He's condemning it, and one day will bring that secret to bear, and people will be punished eternally if they have not repented of that particular sin. He did not leave the room the day you were molested. He was there, and he was there in the darkness, and he was holding you and ready to lead you to a place that's better, to a place of comfort. That to me is a very important blessing to the believer in God. If we believe that God just got moved out of the room, he didn't want to be there, he wasn't there, and he left you alone to suffer the humiliation that might come your way, that didn't happen. God was there. Because if you take him out of the room, why would you ever want to invite him back when you try to deal with the results of your calamity? He's there. His wrath is being expressed, and in his time, he will bring judgment, either in time or in eternity. But what is important there for us to know is that God is there holding us up and leading us. That is the first place for healing. How can we find healing in God if we think that he doesn't have any part to do in this and he left us there to suffer alone? The child, the adult, has to realize as a victim they were not the fault of this. This was the sin in men's heart. God allowed it, but God will condemn it and bring it into judgment. We also need to understand that our total existence is in the hand of God. We cannot escape him. We cannot escape the judgment. But what we observe is the fact that even life and death is in his hand. James 4 in verse 15. We should not presume that we'll live tomorrow, do this or that. But we should rather say, if the Lord will, we will live and do this or that. Also, Peter tells us that sometimes we will suffer for wrongdoing, and sometimes we'll suffer for doing that is right. He said it's better, if God should so will, that we suffer for well-doing than for wrongdoing. That means sometimes we will suffer when we're doing right. A person may lose their job because they refuse to do something that is sin. Others may not that particular time. Some may die for their faith. Others will be spared. For example, in Acts the 12th chapter, we see the history unfold about people being persecuted and put to death. And the Apostle John, chapter 12, he's put to death by the sword. But Peter is spared. Peter is released. He escapes the sword. But James suffers the sword. How could that news become a comfort to James' mother, for example? The comfort is that her son glorified God. Yes, he died. God so willed that he will not live to see another day. But he will not have the glory of heaven taken from him just because the sword has taken the spirit of life from him. Peter is allowed to live, according to God's will, for another day to glorify God before he will glorify God in death. From God's eternal perspective, all of the misfortune, all the pain, all the suffering never robs us from the glory of heaven that we'll enjoy. The judgment will come. Ungodly people will be cast by the wrath of God into hell. Every secret will be exposed if it has not been exposed already. And what we realize that we cannot have the glory of heaven taken from us, but we may have another day. While another dies, we may have another day to glorify God in the life that we're living. That's a wonderful place to live before God. To know that in our calamity, God not only knows it, but he's there with us, helping us get through it. And that we may have an opportunity by the hard and harsh experiences we have to glorify God by helping others who go through that. But one thing is for certain, we can rest assured that God will lead us through these times, and that we never, because we have faith in God, never have to allow a calamity to be a catastrophe. Thank you for visiting with us.